Evening, welcome to the tonight's East Hampton Library Zoom talk. Tonight we have back with us Evan Weiner, who will be giving a talk tonight about the Pacific Northwest. And if anyone has any questions, feel free to type them in the chat. At toward the end, we'll do
Yeah,
a.
they can do it in the middle. I don't care.
Oh, okay. Yeah,
Uh,
if you want to just unmute, then ask your question. But without further ado, I'll turn over tonight's talk to Evan Weiner.
okay, thank you, Dino, for inviting me, and thank everybody for being here today. I'm going to be kind of a tour guide for you today. We're going to take a look at Seattle and Victoria, British Columbia, and Vancouver, British Columbia, and how basically there's similarities there, but there was also some residual benefits or not benefits, well, in some cases benefits, but some residual hostility as late as 1859 between the Brits and the Americans. So that's Seattle. And actually, that was all I had to do is go to my daughter's balcony and take that picture, and that's what she sees. My friend Fiona up in Victoria, which may be the most British city in North America, Victoria, BC, and Lionsgate Bridge over there in Vancouver. The Pacific Northwest or the Pacific Southwest, depending on which side of the border you are on. Seattle was a boom or a bust city that was built on the gold rush between 1896 and 1899. Victoria's development was aided by the opium trade in the gold rush. Vancouver's growth began with the Fraser Gold Rush of 1858 that brought about 25,000 men, mainly from California, to nearby New Westminster, which is actually a suburb today, founded on February 14th, 1859 on the Fraser River on the way to the Fraser Canyon. The Seattle area, well, people have been there for at least 4,000 years, Native Americans. The first European to visit the Seattle area was George Vancouver in May of 1792. He was on an expedition of the Pacific Northwest from 1791 through 95, and he was to chart the Pacific Northwest or the Pacific Southeast, and the area became part of the Oregon Territory. 5440 or fight. That was that whole area that some people, like the President of the United States, James Polk Knox, back the 11th President of the United States, wanted back then. In 1818, the United States and Great Britain, after the War of 1812, established a joint claim over the Oregon Territory. Now, that's the region west of the Rocky Mountains between 42 North, which was the northern boundary of Spain in those days, which owned Mexico or California out to California, and 5440 North, and that was the southern boundary of the Russian-Alaskan Territory. By 1840s or the 1840s, joint control had broken down. The expansionist Democrats, including their 1844 presidential candidate, James K. Polk, claimed the entire territory for the United States, except there was a problem there because the United States didn't have a claim to the territory, really, but James Knox Polk said, yeah, it's ours. This expansionist design was expressed by Polk's famous campaign slogan, 5440 or fight. The slogan became a rallying cry of the settlers in the territory. The popular phrase was picked up from Senator William Allen of Ohio, who coined the expression in an 1844 speech on the Senate floor. The dispute was settled in 1846, partially because there was a war in Mexico and Polk didn't want to send troops up to the Pacific Northwest, or in England's case, the Pacific Southeast, or Southwest rather, and they didn't want to get into a war, so they said, let's take care of this. The Brits weren't too interested in it. The Americans, okay, we could take it. The Brits had basically gotten all the fox fur out of it, so wasn't much business there for them anymore. So the border is settled in 1846, and all except Vancouver Island would be part of the British North American territory. Well, what do we do with Vancouver Island, which sticks into the 49th parallel or underneath the 49th parallel. I don't know if you know that much about the Oregon Territory, but maybe I should shock you. Keep Portland weird. Well, it was more than just weird. The Webster-Ashburton Treaty of 1842 partially delineated the northeastern U.S.-Canadian border, but left the border of the Oregon Territory unsettled. Oh, 1844. All black people were ordered to get out of the Oregon country, the expansive territory under American rule that stretched from the Pacific Ocean to the Rocky Mountains. Those who refused to leave could be severely whipped, the provisional government law declared by not less than 20 or more than 39 stripes, to be repeated every 6 months until they left. No black was ever lashed. And that is the Columbia River. That was originally supposed to be the border between United States territory and British territory. It didn't work out that way. The Oregon Territory, that lasted August 14th, 1848 until February 14th, 1859, when the southwestern portion of the territory was admitted to the Union as the state of Oregon, and that would create the Washington Territory. Now, the region was divided between the UK and the US in 1846 with the Oregon Treaty. The American area would include the states of Oregon, Washington, Idaho, as well as parts of Wyoming and Montana. The British part would include all of British Columbia and a piece of Alberta. Ever hear about the Pig War? Pig War, 1859, over those islands behind my wife standing there about 30 years ago. Anybody ever hear of the Pig War? Yes or no? If you didn't, don't feel bad about it. Not too many people know about it, but it lasted a long time. The wording of the Oregon Treaty was vague when it came to the channel, which separates the continent from Vancouver Island, because there are several navigable waterways between Vancouver Island and the mainland. The ownership of the San Juan Islands remained contested. San Juan because the Spanish and English had claims to those islands back in the 18th century. In 1859, a pig wandered from the British Canadian side to the American side and was found in an American settler's garden. Well, the American did what he thought was right, shot the pig. The British demanded compensation, and American troops were sent to occupy the island while the British warships patrolled offshore. The dispute was finally settled in 1872, and there was some action between the Brits and the Americans over the years because a pig wandered to the American side. Well, long before Seattle, there was that waterway, and Native Americans lived there, and that's a look from the south at looking north at Seattle. 1851, the large party led by Luther Collins made a location on the land at the mouth of the Duwamish River. They formally claimed it on September 14th, 1851. 13 days later, members of the Collins Party, on their way to their claim, passed 3 scouts of the Denny Party. Members of the Denny Party claimed land on Alki Point on September 28th, 1851. If you ever travel in Seattle, it seems like the roads go nowhere. It's not all true, but the roads kind of are funky because there were different people who claimed the land in Seattle, proper Seattle. So before Seattle, the Seattle area was previously inhabited by Native Americans for at least 4,000 years. Arthur A. Denny and the Denny Party arrived from Illinois via Portland, Oregon on the schooner Exact at Alki Point on November 13th, 1851. The settlement was moved to the eastern shore of Elliott Bay, named Seattle, 1852, after Chief C. Howell of the local Duwamish and Suquamish tribes. Nighttime in Seattle. Logging was Seattle's first major industry. By the late 19th century, the city had become a commercial and shipbuilding center as a gateway to Alaska during the Klondike Gold Rush, and that is Pioneer Square. And the unfortunate part today about Pioneer Square, you really got to be careful walking through Pioneer Square because there are a lot of homeless who will start up with you if you allow them to. So When you walk through downtown Seattle, and it's gorgeous, Pioneer Square is where the city began, but it's a lot of homeless there, and a lot of people are avoiding that area now. The early structures in the neighborhood were mostly wooden and nearly all burned in the Great Seattle Fire of 1889. By the end of 1890, dozens of brick and stone buildings had been erected in their stead. Now, this fire, everything that could go wrong went wrong with this fire. Everything you could imagine, like running out of water to fight the fire. In the 1960s, Pioneer Square became a target of urban renewal. One proposal was to replace the buildings with parking garages to serve downtown Seattle. Another proposal was to build a ring road around, which would have required destroying many of Pioneer Square's buildings. In 1970, it was listed on the National Register of Historic Places. And there is something called the Seattle Underground. And if it looks dusty and it looks like garbage, that's what it is. It is dusty, it's filled with garbage, but people take the walking tour in the Seattle Underground. The Seattle Underground is a network of underground passageways and basements in the Pioneer Square neighborhood. They were located at ground level when the city was built in the mid-19th century, but fell into disuse after the streets were elevated. It's the reason they were elevated. In recent decades, they've become a tourist attraction with guided tours taking place around the area. Now, again, the fire, that's the Opera House, or was the Opera House on Front Street. And the problem in downtown Seattle then, when things go wrong, they really go wrong. The Great Seattle Fire destroyed the entire central business district on June 6, 1889. Fire burned for several hours, destroying about 25 blocks, causing $20 million worth of damage, which would be $683 million today. As a result of the fire, streets in the Pioneer Square neighborhood were elevated 22 feet above the pre-fire street level, and new buildings made of wood were banned. In 1852, Henry Yesler began construction of the first steam-powered mill in the Pacific Northwest. I guess it was Pacific Northwest then. Because of the easy access to lumber, nearly every building was constructed of the affordable but combustible timber. And there is the fire. And the fire started out as kind of a little spark and boom. Seattle was at or below sea level and was frequently hit with massive flooding, requiring the buildings to be built on wooden stilts. The town also used hollowed out scrap logs propped up on wooden braces as sewer and water pipes, increasing the combustibility loading. On June 6th, 1889, John Bach, a Swedish assistant in Victor Claremont's woodworking shop at the corner of Front Street, now First Avenue, and Madison Avenue, was using heating glue over a gasoline fire. I don't know about you, but even my elementary understanding of fire is maybe you shouldn't have used glue over a gasoline fire, but they did. And there is the fire, colorized now. Sometime after 2:15 in the afternoon, the glue boiled over, caught fire, spread to the floors. Of course, the floors were covered by wooden chips and turpentine. Tried to put out the fire with water, but that only thinned out the turpentine and spread the fire further. Seattle's water supply was provided by the privately owned Spring Hill Water Company. Fire hydrants were only located on every other streets, and the pipes were small, and many of them, of course, out of hollowed logs, and some of those logs, with the water, would burn as well in the fire. Another picture. This is up Yesler Way in Seattle. As more hoses were added to fight the fire, the water pressure fell to the point that the hoses stopped working. Firemen tried to keep the fire from spreading further by pumping water from Elliott Bay onto the commercial mill, but the tide was out, and the hoses weren't long enough to reach the side of the building closest to the fire. And then the wind started picking up. By 4 o'clock, most of the residents realized that goodbye downtown Seattle, We're going to be sleepless in Seattle tonight because we ain't got a place to live. The fire burned until 3 a.m. Thousands of people were displaced. 5,000 men lost their jobs. The city estimated its losses at over $8 million. And that number didn't even include the human losses or those of water and electrical services. The fire. Most businesses decided to rebuild where they had been. The rebuilding began almost immediately. Wooden buildings were banned in the burnt out district to be replaced by brick. At the same time, the streets were raised 22 feet in places, helping to level the hilly city. Within a year, 564 buildings had been built. Most of the reconstruction was complete and the businesses had reopened. I don't know about how many of you have ever gone down to Pike's Place, but there is a significant drop going down to Pike's Place where they built up the buildings at 22 feet. Seattle's fire department shifted from a volunteer to a paid force with new firehouses and a new fire chief. The city took control of the water supply, increasing the number of fire hydrants and adding larger pipes. Brick buildings were built. New city ordinances set standards for the thickness of walls and required division walls between buildings. Well, let's strike it rich. Gold in them there hills. Actually, the Klondike in Dawson City helped pull the Americans out of what is now known as a depression, but was known as the Panic of 1893. And Seattle would benefit from it. And some of the stores you go to today, or some of the brands you use today, well, you'll see in a couple of minutes what happened to them. Strike it rich. The second and most dramatic boom and bust resulted from the Klondike Gold Rush, which ended the depression that had begun with the Panic of 1893. By the way, the word depression was never used until Herbert Hoover used it in 1929. They were always the panics. There was a panic in 1893, a panic in 1907. In short time, Seattle became a major transportation center. Go to the Klondike, make your fortune, gold. Join the journey. There is a Klondike Museum now in Seattle, partly because the Klondike made Seattle what it is today. On July 14th, 1897, the SS Portland docked with its famous gold of ton, and Seattle became the main transportation and supply point for miners in Alaska and the Yukon. You could also catch a boat in San Francisco. The boom lasted well into the early part of the 20th century and funded many new Seattle companies and products. For instance, let's go back to 1907. And there was a 19-year-old guy by the name of James E. Casey, and he borrowed about $100, $3,400 today, from a friend and founded a company called the American Messenger Company. You know that company today as United Parcel Service or UPS. The Smith Building, 1914, the tallest building on the West Coast, tallest building west of Chicago when it opened. Other Seattle companies founded during this period included Nordstrom's. How many of you go to Nordstrom's? And how many have Eddie Bauer products? Seattle brought in the Olmsted Brothers, the landscape architectural firm, to design a system of parks and boulevards. And this is now the University of Washington. But it wasn't the University of Washington in 1909. It was the Alaska Yukon Pacific Exposition of 1909. That's where the university went. The Gold Rush era culminated in the Alaska Yukon Pacific Exposition of 1909, which is largely responsible for the layout of today's University of Washington campus. Now, Seattle was kind of prosperous in the 1920s, as was most of the United States, but when the Depression hit, it hit hard in the Pacific Northwest, and the Seattle area experienced some of the country's harshest labor strife of that era. Oh, by the way, what I don't have listed here, but I should add, in 1917, the only general strike in United States history took place in Seattle, and that was because of working conditions, and it lasted 3 days. But that's what happened in Seattle in 1917. A general strike, and then the word was out, the communists were behind it, and Oh, the communists are behind it. We better get back to work. And within 6 days, it was over. But anyway, the maritime strike of 1934 cost Seattle much of its maritime traffic, which was rerouted to the port of Los Angeles. War work again brought local prosperity during World War II, and it centered around Boeing. I'm not going to talk about Boeing today. We'll just talk about Boeing there. After the war, the local economy dipped. It rose again with Boeing's growing dominance in the commercial airline market. And there is Boeing, and there is Seattle. It's actually not Seattle. It's just south of Seattle where Boeing Airfield is. Another major economic downturn was in the late 1960s and early 1970s, at a time when Boeing was heavily affected by the oil crisis, loss of government contracts, and cost and delays associated with the Boeing 747. Many people left the area to look for work elsewhere, and two local real estate agents put up a billboard reading, "Will the last person leaving Seattle turn out the lights?" 1962 World's Fair. Well, that kind of put Seattle back on the map for a few years. And that, of course, is the building in Seattle that featured the Seattle World's Fair. It was called the Space Needle. The Century 21 Exposition, also the Seattle World's Fair, was held April 21st to October 21st, 1962. In the Space Needle, there were some of the first cordless phones in the country. The fair was the site of some of the first satellite transmissions of telephone calls and television broadcasts. It's a Seattle landmark. I don't know how many of you have been out to Seattle. You know how big the World's Fair area is in Queens. This is just a little postage stamp size area. It's not very big, but they did manage to put the World's Fair in there. The U.S. government, for its part, was exceedingly interested in demonstrating the nation's scientific prowess to the world, and committed $9 million, about $93 million today, to the fair, chiefly to build the NASA National Aeronautics and Space Administration themed United States Science Exhibit, which is now called the Pacific Science Center. A number of foreign governments provided the international flavor crucial to the World's Fair, and eventually 35 states signed on as exhibitors. Now, there was a monorail built. The monorail really doesn't go anywhere. It was supposed to go all around the city. It goes a mile. It goes a mile. It doesn't even get to downtown Seattle. But it's there. They're not moving it, but they're not extending it either. The Seattle Center monorail was built for the 62 Seattle World's Fair to provide a crucial link between the fairgrounds and the amenities of downtown. Construction began in April of 61. The monorail was never completed. Along with the Space Needle, the Seattle Center, which is now a hockey arena, the monorail is considered an iconic landmark. Ray Charles, Quincy Jones, the Seattle jazz scene, and it was a big scene. In fact, music is essential to Seattle. Between 1918 and 1951, there were nearly 24 jazz clubs along Jackson Street. Some of them were speakeasies between 1918 and 1933. Running from the current Chinatown International District to the Central District, the jazz scene developed the early careers of Ray Charles and Quincy Jones and Bumps Blackwell, who was a famous producer, Ernest Anderson, and others. The Brothers Four vocal group The Fleetwoods, 1960 garage rockers like the Wailers and the Sonics, and the instrumental surf group The Ventures, all part of the Seattle scene. And music, Nirvana, and there is Kurt Cobain. Seattle is considered to be the home of grunge music, having produced artists such as Nirvana, Soundgarden, Alice in Chains, Pearl Jam, Mahoney, all of whom reached international audiences in the early 1990s. And Jimmy played Seattle before he played Monterey. Jimi Hendrix, on November 27th, 1942, at Seattle's King County Hospital, was born. Young Jimmy took an interest in music, drawing influence from virtually every major artist at the time. including B.B. King and Muddy Waters and Howling Wolf and Buddy Holly and Robert Johnson. Entirely self-taught, Jimmy's inability to read music made him concentrate even harder on the music he had heard. The Seattle Pilots, the most famous book in baseball. You have to have this book in your library. I know you do. Ball four, and that's my friend Jim Bouton. Jim Bouton and I were friends. We crisscrossed speaking. The only time we ever spoke together, the only time we were ever in the same venue, and we shared the stage was at Yogi Berra's Learning Museum over at Montclair State College in New Jersey. It was the only time that we shared a podium, which was cool. One year we were at Ithaca in 2004 at Ithaca we were at Ithaca speaking at the college, and he was there the week before, I was there the week after. He said, yeah, we want to do something together, but we never could in our schedules, because I was still a working journalist back in those days. But we finally had that one time together. Seattle was awarded the Major League Baseball expansion team in 1968. Seattle Pilots franchise would last 1 year. The owners would declare bankruptcy and the franchise moved to Milwaukee in 1970. The 1969 Pilots season was chronicled in what was the most important baseball book ever written, Ball Four. So what becomes of sports relics? Well, you end up in the museum. The Kingdome was blown away and was replaced by a baseball stadium and a football stadium. The Kingdome opened in 1976 for the Seattle Seahawks football team and was built as a response to baseball, Seattle suing Major League Baseball after the Pilots team left, saying you took the team out through bankruptcy, you didn't give us a chance. They were sued on antitrust grounds, and then they built the stadium. And, the Seattle Mariners were formed and started playing in 1977. Meanwhile, that's the Larry O'Brien Trophy, the NBA trophy for winning the championship, which Seattle did in 1979. Team moved in 2008, and whatever is left of the Seattle Supersonics franchise sits in this museum. Seattle should be a sports owner's dream town. They have these Fortune 500 companies like Amazon, Starbucks, Nordstrom's, Expeditors International, Washington. Costco, the largest retail company in Washington, is in Issaquah. Microsoft is in Redmond. I was just in Redmond in April. That town is just booming. Weyerhaeuser, the forest products company, is based in Federal Way. Bellevue is home to the truck manufacturer PACCAR. Other major corporations in the area: Nintendo America in Redmond, T-Mobile US in Bellevue, Expia Inc. in Bellevue, Providence Health and Services, the state's largest healthcare system and the fifth largest employer, just over the river in Renton, across from Route 90. But they do have trouble with their sports teams. That's the Kingdome back in 1992. After the MLB Pilots left, King County sued MLB. The Kingdome was built to house a baseball team and a football team. The National Football League expanded in 1976. MLB settled the Pilots' case by getting a team in 1977. Seattle lost nearly both teams. The baseball team to St. Petersburg, the football team to Anaheim. The problematic 1962 World's Fair Arena, that's Seattle Supersonics NBA team's owners decided it wasn't state-of-the-art in 2008. Goodbye. Seattle said, we're not building a new building. Seattle built a baseball and a football stadium in the late 1990s, early 2000s. The football team nearly moved to Anaheim. 1992, the baseball team was sold to Nintendo's then president, Hiroshi Yamauchi, but there was xenophobia. In 1991-93, the Major League Baseball commissioner, Fay Vincent, said the sale to Yamauchi was unlikely. Vincent was just such a miserable guy, Ivy League lawyer, and he should have known better. But no, you know what? He's a Yaley. No, well, we're not selling to foreigners. Team was eventually sold and stayed in Seattle. MLB didn't want foreign ownership of the team, but they took his money, but they did not let him run his business. Somebody else ran the business. The rebuilt arena, that's what it looks like today, and they have a National Hockey League team in there, and they'll probably be awarded a National Basketball Association team within 2 years. 2021, the city finally put a National Hockey League team on ice. It took 45 years after the NHL planned to place a team in Seattle in 1976. It is the gateway to Asia, again, from my daughter's apartment building. The Port of Seattle, which also operates SeaTac International Airport, it's a major gateway for trade with Asia and cruises to Alaska. It is the 8th largest port in the United States in terms of container capacity. Oh, that is, believe it or not, an iconic sign in Seattle, the Elephant Super Car Wash. And when it flashes in green. People go over there to take pictures of that sign. They don't necessarily wash their cars there, but they take pictures of the sign. People go there internationally. The Public Market Center, better known as Pike's Market, across the street's the original Starbucks. Pike Place Market is a public market in Seattle, Washington, United States, opened on August 17th, 1907. It is one of the oldest continuously operated public markets in the United States. 1963, a proposal was floated to demolish the Pike Peak Market and replace it with Pike Plaza, which would have included a hotel, apartment building, 4 office buildings, and a hockey arena and a parking garage. And that is the daily fare there. And if you're there at the right time, you will see people flinging fish to one another, the fish that you just bought. An initiative was passed on November 2nd, 1971, that created a historic district and returned the market to public hands. A foggy morning, couldn't see the top of the Space Needle. Starbucks started in Seattle in 1971, and because this is a family talk, I put my hand over there. She's naked, the mermaid. Okay, let's go up to Victoria. The newlywed and the nearly dead. That's who lives in Victoria, the newlywed and the newly dead. Actually, Victoria is probably the best climate for anybody in Canada in the winter. It never gets cold, it never snows there, and in the summer it never gets above about 72, 73 degrees, and there's Parliament. It's an old trading post. The British agent James Douglas and his men came upon these shores searching the Pacific coast for new Hudson Bay Company headquarters. Welcomed by the First Nations Luke Waman, as new trading partners, Douglas and his entourage set up a trading post on these lands in 1842. And that's the port of Victoria, home of Canada's Pacific Naval Fleet. Named for Queen Victoria, the city is one of the oldest in the Pacific Northwest or the Pacific Southwest. It's there in the British settlement, with the British settlement beginning in 1843. And that's the Inner Harbor. I don't know how many of you have walked through the Inner Harbor, but it's a great little walk. In 1858, gold was discovered on the Fraser River. Miners from around the world came to Victoria, a well-situated seaport and major outfitting center. Notice I spelled it center the English way. For the mainland goldfields, economic activity shifted from trade to mercantilism. Fort Victoria became a rich, populous city with a dwindling Aboriginal population. That is by the sea, sunset. In 1866, Vancouver Island and British Columbia united to form a single colony. 2 years later, the city of Victoria was declared its capital. In 1867, there were 3 options open for the British Columbia colony: continue as a British colony, to be annexed by the United States, or to confederate with a newly formed Dominion of Canada. In Britain, some hoped that the North American colonies would just disappear, get away, join the United States. They didn't care anymore, or become a country. You're an economic drain. Let's get out of there. America virtually surrounded the British colony, or the British colonial territory. The northwest border was now Alaska. South of the 49th parallel was the U.S. territories. Ships and demands. Civil War. British Columbia almost became part of the United States because of something happening in Alabama. You'd say, what? The Alabama claims were a series of demands for damages sought by the government of the United States from the United Kingdom in 1869. The attacks upon Union merchant ships by Confederate Navy commerce raiders built in Britain or British ship yards during the American Civil War. That is British Columbia. It's just outside of Vancouver. Just drive a little bit outside of Vancouver, and that's what you see. When American Secretary of State William H. Seward negotiated the Alaska Purchase with Russia in 1867, he intended it as the first step in a comprehensive plan to gain control of the entire Pacific Northwest, for America's Pacific Northwest. Seward expected British Columbia to seek annexation to the U.S. and thought Britain might accept this in exchange for the Alabama claims. That is one of the oldest buildings in Victoria. London stalled. The American commercial and financial groups pressured Washington for a quick settlement of the dispute on a cash basis. There was some growing Canadian national sentiment in British Columbia calling for staying inside the British Empire. See, they wanted to build a wall. They were thinking about building a wall to keep out those Washingtonians who were drunk and causing havoc on their side of the border. They never did build the wall, but they went elsewhere. Congress became preoccupied with Reconstruction, and most Americans showed little interest in the territorial expansion. Well, there would then be an alliance, and that was the 150th anniversary of Canada, July 1st, 2017, 1867, July 1st is when Canada became a country. 1869, the American Secretary of State William Seward visited Victoria, proposing an economic alliance between Alaska, BC, British Columbia, Washington, Oregon, and California. And it all hinged on this, a railroad, a railroad. If the Americans came up with money for a railroad, BC might have taken it. But a delegation was sent to Ottawa in 1870 to present British Columbia's demands to Canada. The demands included a call for responsible provincial government, like Nova Scotia, economic aid, debt concessions, and the construction of a major transportation link. The railroad would eventually come, the railroad would eventually come. BC joined in 1871. 1871, British Columbia became the sixth province of the Dominion of Canada. During the late 1800s and early 1900s, Victoria became the busiest seaport north of San Francisco. Time for tea. How many of you been in Victoria at 4 o'clock and went to that building and had some tea at 4 o'clock? Tea time. The current Parliament buildings were constructed between 1893 and 1897 on the city's inner harbor. The Canadian Pacific Railway's Grand Empress Hotel was constructed in 1908. With construction of the Royal BC Museum nearby, the inner harbor has become the city's symbolic center. And there was Chinatown. There was a lot of activity going on in Chinatown. Few wealthy Chinese merchants from San Francisco came to Victoria by boat June 1858. They bought properties on Camarent Street, where they built wooden huts in preparation for the arrival of laborers recruited for panning gold in the Fraser River. Hong Kong was the largest exporter of raw and refined opium to North America. Significant portion of raw opium ended up in Victoria, Vancouver, San Francisco, and Tacoma near Seattle. The refined opium was sold as is. Raw opium was processed at the factories in either Canada or the United States. Opium was a common and legal import from China. Up until 1865, opium was largely unregulated on Vancouver Island, the inner harbor. Victoria was a major port city, and it was a lively town with visitors from all over the world. Victoria was a British Confederate, and Hong Kong was a British colony. That meant the trade dynamic between the two ports allowed opium to be legally exchanged. 1880, the United States and China came up with an agreement that prohibited opium import into the other country. Chinese opium merchants in the United States could no longer import opium directly from China, but rather they began to rely on opium supplies coming over from Victoria. Opium, it's a big deal there. Smuggling of opium was common because the duty on opium was about $5, about 2,650 Canadian or 1,904 or 1,940 US dollars today. A pound in Canada, but $10, $307 today, a pound in the US. The Canadian government was aware of the smuggling problem, but did little to suppress it, simply because the trade helped promote opium manufacturing and thus generating revenue for the government. Exactly how well Canada's government profited from Victoria's opium industry between 1860 and 1908 is unknown, as much of the smoking opium produced here was smuggled into the U.S. after production. After a 1908 report exposed the extent to which the opium imported by and taxed in Canada was designed or destined for re-export to the U.S., the government quickly distanced itself from the industry and outlawed manufacturing of smoking opium. Check out that blue building there. Check out that blue building right in the middle there that is not painted green and not painted brownish. The locals say that Frederick Trump had a brothel in that blue building. And that is why that building is painted blue. His grandson said, never happened, never happened. Nope, never happened. It never happened. Well, he was up there at the time, Frederick Trump. It is well known that Donald Trump's grandfather, Frederick Trump, had brothels in British Columbia during the Klondike Gold Rush at the turn of the 20th century. The locals will tell you that Frederick Trump operated a brothel in Victoria as well. Donald Trump has denied that his grandfather ran brothels in British Columbia, but the lore and the legend is that that blue building was Frederick Trump's building. Go hang out in Victoria. Victoria's position as the commercial center of British Columbia was lost to the city of Vancouver. The city subsequently began cultivating an image of a genteel civility within its natural setting, aided by the impressions of visitors such as Rudyard Kipling, the opening of the popular Butchart Gardens in 1904. It's a retirement community. It's known for its disproportionately large retiree population, about 6.4 of the percent of the population of Victoria and the surrounding area. They're over the age of 80, the highest proportion for any of Canada's metropolitan areas. The city also boasts the country's third highest concentration of people 65 and older, 17.8%, only behind Peterborough, Ontario. Winters are miserable in Peterborough, and Kelowna, British Columbia. Winters are miserable there as well. They like Liz II there. Oh yeah, they like the Queen, Queen Elizabeth II. She's got statues of her all over Canada. They liked her right in front of the Parliament there. It is British Columbia after all, and you have to have your requisite, here are all the logos of all the provinces of Canada, and there's the Union Jack and all that other stuff. And it's on to Vancouver. Fort Vancouver, 19th century fur trading post that was the headquarters of the Hudson Bay Company's Columbia Department, located in the Pacific Northwest or Southwest. Named for Captain George Vancouver, the fort was located on the northern bank of the Columbia River in present-day Vancouver, Washington. The fort was a major center of the regional fur trade. Every year, trade goods and supplies from London arrived from either ships sailing to the Pacific Ocean or overland from the Hudson Bay via the York Factory Express. At its pinnacle, Fort Washington was the most important city on the Pacific coast, or inland from the Pacific coast, actually. 34 outposts, 24 ports, 6 ships, 600 employees, opera houses, schools, libraries, all in that area. Looking east from Vancouver, the Oregon Treaty set the Canadian United States border, or then the British United States border, at the 49th parallel, putting Fort Vancouver within American territory. The Hudson's Bay Company's operations in the territory were effectively stifled by the treaty and became unprofitable, soon closed down. Fort Vancouver was abandoned. And this is the new Vancouver, and looking at the city skyline. With a population density of 18,837 residents per square kilometer, downtown Vancouver is the densest city center of all primary downtowns in Canada's census metropolitan areas, according to Statistics Canada data. There are 662,248 people who live in Vancouver, up from 631,486 in 2016. There are about 2.6 million people living in the greater Vancouver area, which is greater than places like Kansas City and Milwaukee and Nashville. It is the third largest metropolitan area in Canada. Vancouver is the 34th biggest metropolitan area in North America. It has more people than areas like Las Vegas, Kansas City, and Cincinnati. A Vancouver sunrise. Vancouver is one of the most diverse cities in Canada. 52% of its residents are not native English speakers. About 48.9% are native speakers of neither English nor French. About 50.6% of the residents belong to a visible minority group. Vancouver is also one of the most expensive cities in Canada and in the world. The modern city overlooking the port. Vancouver is among British Columbia's youngest cities. The first European settlement in what is now Vancouver was not until 1862 at McCleary's Farm on the Fraser River, just east of the ancient village of Muskegon in what is now Marpole. A sawmill established at Moodyville, now the city of North Vancouver, in 1863 began the city's long relationship with logging. And what happens when you have a relationship with logging and things are built of wood? You have a problem. And Vancouver is made by the transcontinental train that went from Halifax to Vancouver. By 1887, the Transcontinental Railway was extended to the city to take advantage of its large natural seaport, which soon became a vital link in the trade route between Asia, East Canada, and Europe. As of 2014, Port Metro Vancouver is the third largest port by tonnage in the Americas, 27th in the world, the busiest and largest in Canada, and the most diversified port in North America. City of Vancouver was incorporated April 6, 1886, same year that the first continental train arrived. It's named after the explorer George Vancouver. And again, they have a problem with wood. They build things of wood. The Great Vancouver Fire was on June 13th. I don't know if that was Friday the 13th. No, look that up. 1886 razed the entire city. The Vancouver Fire Department was established that year, and the city quickly rebuilt. Vancouver's population grew from a settlement of 1,000 in 1881 to 20,000 by the turn of the century, and 100,000 by 1911. Canada, there's the big sign. Vancouver's scenic location makes it a major tourist destination. People visit the city's gardens, Stanley Park, Queen Elizabeth Park, Van Dusen Botanical Garden, and the mountains, and the ocean, and the forest, and the parklands, which surround the city. About 1 million people pass through Vancouver on cruise ships heading to Alaska. That unfortunately burnt down. That was a very scenic place in Stanley Park, Prospect Point. Catch this out. Modern women's movement starting in the late 19th century. And look what happened in Vancouver. First wave feminism was a period of feminism activity that occurred during the 19th and 20th century. Got a question. Hi, planning a trip to LA, would like to add a cruise to Alaska. I'd leave from, when I spoke on cruise ships, I always left from Vancouver. But there are the cruise ships out of Seattle. If you take the cruise ship out of Seattle, you go to Victoria. So if you go out of Vancouver, you don't go to Victoria. So Seattle's interesting, Vancouver's interesting, and you get to go to Victoria. So do that. That's what I would do. First wave feminism was a period of feminist activities and throughout, thought that occurred during the late 19th century and the early 20th century. And it was going on throughout the Western world. It focused on legal issues, primarily on securing women's right to vote. 1880, British Columbia. 51% of high school graduates were female. Amazing. These percentages continued to increase right through the 1950s. First wave feminism was a period of feminist activities, like I said. Why are we not moving here? And there would be a woman who's going to amaze you by the name of Mary Ellen Smith, and check her out. Now, there's some good and there's some bad to her. Talk about the good first. She was an activist as a member of the Suffrage League of Canada. Her husband, Ralph Smith, died in February 1917, and she ran to succeed him as a member of the Legislative Assembly for Vancouver in January 1918 by election. She ran as an independent liberal on the slogan, "Women and Children First." She was elected by a wide margin, becoming the first woman in the BC legislature. As a legislator, she introduced the Minimum Wage Act of 1918, a law establishing a minimum wage for women of $12.77, 227 Canadian or 166 US today per week. She helped enact laws establishing juvenile courts, allowing women to sit as judges, passing laws protecting women in the workplace. There she is. She also worked to pass the Mothers' Pension Act in 1924, later renamed the Mothers' Allowances Act in 1937. This act provided divorced, deserted, or widowed wives with guaranteed monthly income to raise children under the age of 16. She also supported anti-Asian and eugenicist politics in British Columbia, including the Women and Girls Protection Act of 1923, which restricted their employment by Asians. She also advocated the sterilization of the feeble-minded, lest their reproduction contribute to race suicide. She accepted the racial science of her day that justified legislation, efforts to protect our own Anglo-Canadian race. Oh, Prohibition. Prohibition came to Canada before it came to the United States. Started on October 1st, 1917, lasted until 1921, when the provincial government established control over alcohol sales. As part of its successful 1916 election prohibition, this is in British Columbia, the provincial Liberal Party promoted prohibition and women's suffrage. Sound like the United States, didn't it? The election ballot included referendums on both issues. Both were approved. Internment camps came to Canada before they came to the United States. Shortly after the December 7th, 1941 attack on Pearl Harbor until 1949, Japanese Canadians were stripped of their homes and businesses, then sent to internment camps and farms in British Columbia, as well as some other parts of Canada. The internment in Canada included the theft, seizure, and sale of property belonging to this forcefully displaced population, which included fishing boats, motor vehicles, houses, farms, businesses, and personal belongings. Japanese Canadians were forced to use the proceeds of forced sales to pay for their basic needs during internment. That was an internment camp and farm. In 1944, the Prime Minister Mackenzie King announced that the Japanese Canadians were to be moved east of the British Columbia interior. The official policy stated that Japanese Canadians must move east of the Rocky Mountains or be deported to Japan following the end of the war. By 1947, many Japanese Canadians had been granted exemption to this enforced no-entry zone. It was not until April 1st, 1949, that Japanese Canadians were granted freedom of movement and could re-enter the protected zone along BC's coast. Hong Kong and the Richmond, Vancouver area, and that's Richmond, which might as well be a suburb of Hong Kong. On December 19th, 1984, the People's Republic of China and the United Kingdom signed the Sino-British Joint Declaration, which validated the 1997 transfer of sovereignty over Hong Kong to China. The declaration prompted immigration of the Hong Kongers. The British government made it clear that Hong Kong citizens would not be granted British citizenship on the grounds that they were residing in a British colony, so instead, numerous residents sought alternative arrangements and migrated to other countries, such as Canada and Richmond, BC. The 1989 Tiananmen Square protests and the massacre in Beijing triggered mass migration in the 1990s. Canada, Australia, and other Commonwealth realms were the primary destination for migrants at the time. Popular cities for migrants included Metro Vancouver, Richmond in the Greater Toronto Area in Canada, Sydney and Melbourne in Australia, and London in the UK. National Basketball Association put a team in Vancouver partially because of the Hong Kong migrants. The NBA's top non-North American TV market was Hong Kong, and the league thought the Hong Kongers who moved to the Vancouver area would embrace the product. That did not happen. Loonies. It's July of 1997. One loonie was about $1.29. To buy every American dollar, you had to spend $1.29 Canadian. To become a Canadian citizen back in 1989 and obtain the treasured passport, immigrants must prove, or had to prove, they established a permanent residence in Canada by purchasing a house and enrolling a child in school. They had to pass a citizenship test. Wealthy investors and entrepreneurs from Hong Kong were given citizenship if they created at least one job or had more than $350,000 US in assets, and be willing to help Canada climb out of the recession by putting at least $245,000 into a job-creating investment firm. They did. Lionsgate Bridge. Vancouver is a major film production area, named after a Vancouver landmark. Lionsgate Bridge, officially known as the First Narrows Bridge. Lionsgate Films, as of 2005, written as Lionsgate, is a North American film production and distribution studio that was founded in 1997. And there is Vancouver. In 2021, Vancouver joined Toronto and Seattle in the top 3, growing at the fastest rate of any other large North American tech market. Vancouver has a lot more in common with Seattle than we do with Calgary, Montreal, Toronto, anywhere else in our country. Christy Clark, the premier of British Columbia, said in an interview, "We should make the most of those cultural commonalities." Sleepless in Seattle?
Yeah.
Well, they were after the fire. Thank you so much. Any questions? Any comments? It is your turn to talk.
We have a question from Larry. Planning a trip to...
Yeah, I tried to answer that. Let me say this, as a guy who has spoken on about 75 cruises, haven't gone back on the cruise ship since COVID, I would go out of Seattle. And the reason why I'd go out of Seattle, because there's the mountains in Seattle, and there's some interesting things to see in Seattle, like Pioneer Square. If you go across, you could go down 90 and you'll see Redmond and Bellevue, and they're interesting places. And you can see the timber as well. But you would go, the cruise terminal is about 2 miles north of the Pike Market. You go to Victoria the next day. It's, overnight. You get to spend the whole day in Victoria. And when I talk about the whole day, you get there 7 o'clock in the morning, you leave 10 o'clock at night. And then you go to Vancouver, which is 3 hours, and you get to spend the whole day in Vancouver. And then there's a sea day, and then you get to, well, it depends on how you go. You could go to Ketchikan. There's the Ketchikan, and there's Juneau. So that would be that. And then you'd go over to the Hubbard Glacier in Skagway. So that's the whole thing. And then you'd come back. But if you want to see Victoria, you'll enjoy, as long as it's not raining, you will really enjoy Victoria. It's a great city. Here comes the brides. Yeah. Elvis went to the World's Fair, remember? Elvis went to the World's Fair. So, anyway, yeah, thank you. Mary, thank you. Oh, you didn't know about the inter? Where do you think the United States got the notion for the interring the citizens? Not from the Canadians. Anybody else?
Yeah. No, I'm sorry. I'm Larry. Was my wife Roz was asking all the questions about,
Oh yeah, blame it on her.
Yeah, that's it.
Blame it on her.
The better half.
Yeah, but go to Seattle.
Yeah,
Go to Seattle first.
And I know who knows who sang that song about
What song?
the theme. The the fields of the greenest greens in Seattle. Bobby Sherman.
Bobby Sherman. I
Yeah.
do know North to Alaska. It's done by Johnny Horton.
Oh, okay.
We did in 1814 we took a little trip. His last two hits were the Battle of New Orleans and North to Alaska. And 1 week I had back to back. I did Cajun culture, and then the next day I did my Alaska talk, piece of my Alaska talk, and hit Johnny Horton in both of them.
No, it was my wife who was asking about the trip, what you recommend. Enjoyed your presentation.
Thank you.
It's thorough. And just one other thing, was there anything to do with the government with the Tacoma Narrows Bridge disaster, the debacle, and then then it was left standing for 11
Oh,
years?
that was
You know
back in
anything
the
about that?
40s. Yeah, that was what, in the 40s, where I think it was
I'm saying
like,
the Washington State government.
yeah, yeah. You know what? The Whitestone Bridge looks just like that bridge.
Yeah, but they learned a lot from that debacle.
Yes,
That
they did.
you need to have another roadway underneath to funnel the winds,
Yep.
and those narrows were like about the worst winds,
Yeah.
and then
Yeah.
they abandoned it.
Yeah. Every time I look at the Whitestone Bridge, I say, could that be the next Tacoma Bridge? But they learned
No,
from that.
no. It was that they learned. Like I said, the engineers learned a lot from
Yep.
and they should never have left the bridge open either.
Yeah.
That's why that car there was a dog who the owner couldn't get the dog out.
Yeah.
And that's what happened. That's who
Yeah.
plunged into the river, and it
Yeah.
was left there for 11 years. During the war, there was no money to rebuild that bridge,
Yeah.
so it wasn't until 1951 they put a new one up there. So,
Yeah.
but very very thorough, very interesting
Thanks.
presentation, and we're looking forward to our trip there next year.
Oh, okay. Go from
Going
Seattle. It's
going
also
to LA?
cheaper.
No, okay.
It's also
All right.
cheaper.
Thank you very much.
Anybody know about the pig war?
I said it sounded like the Mrs. O'Leary's cow. Right, the very similar stories.
Yep. Lasted 13 years.
Yeah, and Chicago was made out of all of wood too. It was
Yep.
like a big tinderbox. Both
Yep.
cities.
Well, let's see. LV, thank you. Or Windy. And John, thank you. And that's it. There's no more.
Thank you. Thank you, Evan. Thank you, everyone, for zooming in this evening for this presentation. And we hope everybody has a great evening, and we'll see you on the next presentation.
Yep. And we'll thank you. And hopefully we'll do another one at some point.
Will do. Will do.
So
Thank you.
have
Thank
a
you.
good night.
Thank you,
And-
East Hampton Library. Thank you, Evan.
Thanks.